I read that you were going to play JonBenét's mother.
Yes.
Okay, tell me. That is wild. Tell me about this. I can't wait to see this. All I needed to see was Melissa McCarthy, Patsy, Ramsey, and I'm in.
It's, you know what, it's been quite a challenge. Yeah. It's living with that, poor family that my heart goes out to them, and
that's not good. Okay, that's not good.
I got nightmares in my head, I fear thoughts build up until I can't feel. My mind fills up into a creature, and it haunts me somewhere much deeper. I got nightmares in my head,
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science. Okay, I know what she means when she says that poor family and my heart goes out to them. She's being sympathetic. But if there's one thing the Ramsays weren't, it's poor. In the history of true crime, I'm not sure I've dealt with a case that has more moneyed or powerful individuals, possibly with the exception of Alex Murdaugh, Alec Baldwin, and Stockton Rush. Anyway, so this is Melissa McCarthy, all dolled up in shocking pink for the 2025 Golden Globes. McCarthy was a presenter for Best Comedy or Musical Series. On the red carpet, she spoke about how she saw a role in the Ramsay saga for Paramount Plus, when shooting will be complete, and also her view, I guess, of the Ramsays. Let's listen in.
That we still kind of, it's still a blood sport. I love Patsy. I love the family. I think we're putting a really great version of it out. I'm hoping we're giving them their humanity as well as telling the story, because when you go back through it, we all lived through it, but when you rewatch it, you're like, oh, I was part of that.
So I'm not sure if you caught that. The reporter was trying to make the point, I think, unless I've misunderstood. She was saying that we still don't know what really happened. Meanwhile, McCarthy sort of talks over her to emphasize the point that the story around the Ramsays has been turned into a blood sport, probably a reference to social media.
Living with that, poor family that my heart goes out to them, and it's still a blood sport.
You can also see Melissa McCarthy saying, I love Patsy, I love the family. She's saying, yeah, I love the Ramsays. And you can see where her loyalties lie and where the goalposts of this production lie. And on what turf? It's solid apologia. It is sympathetic to the Ramsays. It is probably going to be quite sentimental as well, which I have to say is quite disappointing.
I love Patsy. I love the family. I think we're putting a really great version of it out. I'm hoping we're giving them their humanity as well as telling the story, because when you go back through it, we all lived through it, but when you rewatch it, you're like, oh, I was part of that.
Now, I certainly don't have a problem with showing the Ramsay family in terms of their humanity. In fact, I encourage that. In fact, I try to do that as well. Give Burke his humanity. Give JonBenét her humanity. Give John his humanity. And give Patsy her humanity. And put all of that humanity together. And what do you end up with? Christmas 1996 in Boulder, this sort of fairy tale. But what is going on under the fairy tale? Where does that humanity take us?
Part of that
there is a family that lost their little girl.
That lost their child, yeah. So I'm really proud of it. We've still got about a month and a half left of it, and it's a really good group. And it's strangely been rewarding and challenging all at the same time.
And of course, from there, the conversation pivots, turning to laughter and keeping it light. It's quite a schizophrenic approach after you've just spoken about the whole Ramsay case. In this episode, we're going to look at some of my thoughts on this next production, as well as earlier productions, vintage productions of the Ramsay narrative, and an exciting new project, a Ramsay project, we'll be diving into in the coming days. Before we get to that, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. If you're finding this analysis worthwhile, please hit the thanks button, and let's get started. So first off, Paramount Plus still haven't announced a release date. I wouldn't be surprised if it's November or December this year. And then secondly, have a look at who they cast to play Linda Arndt. Alison Peel. Is she the right choice? I think a young Frances McDormand would have made a far better choice. I do think Patsy is very difficult to cast, though. If you can't even basically get the aesthetics right, I personally just think, although I love Melissa McCarthy, I just don't think she's the right weight category for Patsy Ramsey. I mean, Patsy Ramsey was a beauty queen. She was always in pretty good shape. In any event, I think a good way of thinking about this new series from Paramount Plus is to begin sort of with the end in mind. And when we come to the end of the Netflix series, in the final 5 minutes of that Netflix 3-parter, Cold Case, Who Killed JonBenét Ramsey, John makes a comment that I must admit I've often thought about, and I've discussed privately with a few people I know who also know this case very well.
That was a real meaningful comment to me, that I know Beth wouldn't want us to be sad. JonBenét wouldn't want us to be sad. The insanity, it was wrong. And I'm sure she would be upset that her parents were accused of this.
If I may, I'd like to deal with this statement compassionately, but also critically. I mean, think about JonBenét. Think about this little girl, who she really was. And if she could talk to us. This, after all, has been about her. And so what would she say? What would she make of all this? What would she say about this? Whether a family member was involved or not, even if a family member was involved, would she want them to suffer on her account? I mean, I doubt it. But I disagree that JonBenét wouldn't want us to be sad.
Not sad, do not weep. For not all tears are an evil.
Because I think there's something very tragic about the Ramsey case, about the family, about what happened to the family. Not only JonBenét died, her mother died as well. In a very real sense, Burke Ramsey also lost his life. And sometimes our grief shows that we are good people. And so what I think is very sad about this case is how justice was played like a football. Some people treated this case like a game, and lives were ruined. People who were doing their jobs meant well. That whole saying, never a good deed goes unpunished. Linda Arendt, Steve Thomas, Lou Smith. This case gobbled them up and spat them out. There's been a massive shitstorm of collateral damage in the form of ruinous lawsuits. Many, many people have seen their lives permanently damaged. Most of all, I feel sad for the people of Boulder and the Boulder police, who had this whole cloud foisted on them. Now, I've been to Boulder, and I've gone there specifically to sort of look into the Ramsey case. And you go to the Ramsey home and you can feel the tension of this unresolved story haunting the neighborhood. I know I was standing there with my camera and a neighbor came out while I was there, and she was watering her garden. And she didn't acknowledge me, she didn't greet me. And I felt the burden. I represented just one of a whole string of looky-loos coming into her neighborhood to look into the house next door to hers, where there's this unresolved darkness, this wraith of deception and death, and just kind of constant undermining, this justice that just ends up being frustrated infinitely. So it really is, when you confronted with that house and the woods that have sprouted around it and the neighbors that every day have got to live next to this house, that you get a real sense of that trauma that has been foisted onto Boulder. And the house itself is sort of gradually disappearing behind a thicket of twigs, trees, branches, and leaves. The house feels a lot like the Ramsey case, or I think the underlying reality of the Ramsey case, which is it's just become very neglected. And there's something shameful about what happened in this case. And 28 years later, ironically, the wrong people are being shamed and blamed. The officers who one moment were celebrating Christmas, the next they were drawn into a sickening intrigue they weren't prepared for. I also don't think it's random that Lou Smith had this incredible record, catching the bad guys, getting so many convictions, such a high percentage, but then the Ramsey case defeated him. Why? How did that happen? I would wager because it was a case that didn't want to be solved. The ransom note tells you that much, and if you accept the ransom note at face value, then I think you throw away your permission slip to solve this case. So the folks that were trying to investigate this case, I mean, they were ultimately outgunned, outplayed, outmaneuvered, outfoxed, and outlasted. You know, if you were on the winning team, well done, well done. But in the same way that the O.J. Simpson trial, you know, there was a victory for one side. I mean, in sum, it amounted to a sad spectacle of injustice, and this one did as well.
You know, the insanity was it was wrong.
But think about how this ball started rolling, how the insanity got its start. If the Ramsays hadn't gone on CNN and the case hadn't been drawn out for months, then years, if you didn't have these PR people, which the Ramsays even hired, if the Ramsays had just allowed themselves to be questioned from the get-go, like accelerate things instead of drawing it out, just allow justice to have run its course, this case could have been settled in a few months, like the Chris Watts case. In the same year, practically, that had happened, probably within 7, 8, 9 months of 1997, it could have been settled even without a trial. I don't know how one can blame the insanity of it while on camera participating in yet another documentary. I think this ended up being Netflix, the biggest hit from Netflix, neatly timed to be released on yet another anniversary of your own daughter's death. And don't forget all the public relations surrounding the boosting of this documentary. John himself went on to so many platforms. I think I counted something like 20 this year alone. And then you come out on the other side complaining about the insanity. I do agree that JonBenét would be upset that her parents were accused of this.
And I'm sure she would be upset that her parents were accused of this.
I do agree that JonBenét would be upset that her parents were accused, because I don't think either of her parents killed JonBenét. And so that it's just not fair for them to be accused of something they didn't do. But it is interesting that John doesn't include Burke in this. How would JonBenét feel about Burke being accused of, and accused of what exactly? And he also gets a little stuck on what they were accused of. I mean, he says of, and then there's a pause, and then he says this. What were they accused of? Well, they were accused by a grand jury, not by social media, not by the media, not by the tabloids. At the end of the day, they were accused by a grand jury of being accessories to a crime involving the death of their own daughter. They were accused by a grand jury of covering up the circumstances surrounding the death of their own daughter. They were also accused of worse, of not protecting their daughter. And I guess that raises the question, not protecting their daughter from what? And I think if you're going to talk about insanity, start there. Start with the insane 3-page ransom note. Because whoever killed JonBenét, writing that note really made a joke of her death. And the insanity only got worse from there. And I think we should be saddened by the overall insanity of this case. The cacophony of conspiracies, the false stories, just this endless stream of falsity, of artifice, of inauthenticity, of fake narratives that are still going on today, right now. You know, Netflix bringing up John Mark Carr in episode 3 also shows just how disingenuous the investigation actually is, or if disingenuous is the wrong word, just how inept they are at investigating this case. Because Carr doesn't even come close to being a viable suspect. You shouldn't even be mentioning him in a serious investigation. Of course, he's a humdinger for the intruder theory. You know, he looks like the right kind of felon. But no one serious about the Ramsey case seriously considers John Mark Carr a suspect. And yet a few minutes after entertaining that farce in episode 3, John tells the camera with a straight face, you know, the insanity, it was wrong. Let me ask you a question. Who are the victims of this insanity? Coming back to Melissa McCarthy, I'd hoped we were going to get an in-depth quality portrait of the Ramsey story. But I must say, I can kind of slap myself on the forehead to think that today, that you're going to get a quality, authentic analysis, in January 2023, it is admittedly naive. So I guess I had a Jerry Maguire moment.
I had 2 slices of bad pizza, went to bed, and grew a conscience.
Someone said to me, this is when I first found out about this thing on Paramount Plus, that due to the affiliation between Paramount Plus and CBS, that this production was likely to be revenge of a sort for the $750 million lawsuit from 8 years ago. Well, I think Melissa McCarthy has made it clear that it's the opposite. This seems to be Ramsay apologia of the highest order. In fact, it's almost like Melissa McCarthy saying, as someone who is playing the role of a Ramsay family member, I'm saying I'm kind of apologizing on behalf of all the media. It literally seems to be apology of the highest order, sympathetically looking at the Ramsays beyond just Patsy and John, but also Patsy's extended family. Nidra, her mother, Don, her father, her sisters Polly and Pam as well. I don't have a problem with that. I mean, I do think that is important and necessary, but not where sentiment and compassion and emotion start to cloud the evidentiary and just the reality of this case. And what this Netflix series has done, if you think about it, hasn't it perfectly teed up the ball for Paramount to hit the apologia all the way onto the green? It's going to have no opposition, where people are going to say, yeah, this is the true story of the Ramsays. I mean, have a look at what's been going on in the mainstream media. They've all cheered the teeing off of this Netflix series, and they're going to be celebrating at the green the sinking of this putt as a sort of a triumphant finale to the Ramsay story. We've seen the mainstream media, big social media players, and big streamers all creating enormous momentum for the next chapter of the Ramsay apologia, where John emerges, and I would say is emerging, as the hero of his story, and it is his story now. So with that in mind, I want to deviate a little from the analysis we've been doing lately. Although we haven't finalized our review of the Netflix series, especially the last episode, I want to start dealing in a lot more depth with Patsy's story. Far greater depth than you might imagine is out there. I also want to revisit some of the vintage depictions of the Ramsay case, such as this one from 2000.
Mrs. Ramsey, I'm Detective Linda Arndt from Boulder Police Department. Please, bring my baby back to me.
And what I think is kind of disturbing to look at is how the media narrative has shifted, almost like a tide. There have been times where certain figures were treated as villains. There were times where those same figures were treated as heroes. And it's very interesting how the media is essentially just a symptom of public sentiment. If you just average out what everyone is thinking or feeling, what the media sort of puts out is basically just a generic average of all that at certain times. And then at other times, I think the media can shape that sentiment, especially when there's money behind it and PR and strategies, and when you aren't free to say whatever you want because of lawsuits. So that's also an aspect. And so I do think one's got to ask, in this day and age, how does reality find its way, or is there now no longer any such thing? Is reality simply what is popularly believed? And so as that fluctuates, reality fluctuates. That is a pretty dangerous world to be in. And can you imagine if that's true and someone is found guilty on a particular set of beliefs, and then as those fluctuate, well, then they can be found innocent. I mean, imagine if the sort of feeling, the vibe towards Alex Murdaugh changes in a couple of years. You just try him again and then he's found innocent. I'd like to think that the legacy of the law has more substance to it than that. And it does feel like there's less and less substance to society and especially to the media today, doesn't it? I mean, as a storyteller, I'm looking around and I see so few stories that are told with any real heart or soul. It's like people have literally lost their souls. And isn't the Ramsey case almost like a story that is about America losing its soul? A family, in a sense, losing its soul or even losing its heart. A justice system, a community finding out that there is no soul to its prosecutors or those fighting for justice, that ultimately that they shouldn't or can't have faith in that system either. It is a very tragic, undermining, devastating story. I mean, especially in the sense that it reveals us and our society to ourselves, doesn't it? And so I want us to think critically about this idea also of having a comedian play Patsy in scenes like these, like the one we've just seen from Fox in 2000. I'm sure McCarthy can do melodrama, but there's literally nothing funny about the Ramsey case besides perhaps that all this time the joke has been on us. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.